chat. I will be fielding those questions and we'll take time in the end to have questions and answers taking place. All right, well, it is 2 o'clock and we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to the stresses of today's world: toxic stress, ACEs, hope, and brain development in the child, presented by Dr. Diane Bales. Dr. Diane Bales is the co director of Better Brains for Babies and has been a faculty member in the Department of Human Development and Family Science and is an Extension Human Development Specialist at the University of Georgia. Her work at UGA includes teaching early brain development, helping Extension agencies educate ECE teachers and other community members, and directing the Child Life program that prepares students to support children's social emotional development and healthcare settings. She's also a great friend of mine, and I am delighted to have her share her wisdom and knowledge with you. You're going to gain so much insight today as she talks to us about the stressors in the world. I also want to take this time for us to acknowledge our funder. We could not do this project without the Georgia Division of Family and Children Services Prevention and Community Support. They are instrumental in the work that we do throughout Georgia and even surrounding states where we're able to share information about Better Brains for Babies Georgia. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Diane Bales.
Thanks, Shanisha. It is great to have so many people here. As of our starting right now, we have 84 people on this webinar. So hopefully we'll have others who are able to watch recordings later on. It's wonderful to see you all. Thanks for the nice introduction. I'm excited to talk about this topic, not because it's fun, not because it's enjoyable, but because it's something that's really important to understand, especially in the world right now. If you reflect on your life and what's going on in your life right now, I'm sure you can identify some places where you are experiencing some stress. Quite possibly you can identify a number of places where you're where you're experiencing quite a lot of stress. And so it's important to understand that those stresses are a part of our lives, they're a part of children's lives, and to understand what are typical stresses. When does stress become dangerous? When does stress have long-term kinds of consequences? And what can we do to help support children through stress to help support healthy brain development? So that's really where we're going today. And so you can see objectives here. We're going to talk about sources of stress, how the brain responds to stress. We're going to talk about the levels of stress. We're going to talk about potential negative effects of long-term toxic stress, including adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. And we're going to talk about ways that adults can buffer the developing brain from toxic stress, including some specific stress reduction strategies. And as we talk about ways adults can buffer the developing brain, one of the things we're going to talk about is the HOPE model, which gives us some information and some ideas about specific things that we can do to combat these adverse childhood experiences. So we're going to do a lot in an hour. And as Shanisha said, I hope you will share your ideas in the chat box. Shanisha, feel free if there are appropriate things you need to questions you need to interrupt me for, feel free to do that. Otherwise, we will also allow some time for questions at the end. So I want to start by talking for just a minute about what we mean by stress. And I'm going to share a couple of different definitions. The one you see on the screen right now is the one we use most often in Better Brains for Babies. A stress is any external stimulus that threatens the balance of the normal equilibrium in the body. So our body's goal is to keep everything in balance. That includes our physical bodies, that includes our emotions, our relationships, all of those kinds of things. Part of the way that that happens is by knowing what to expect and having, things be predictable. Now, that does not unfortunately always happen in life. And so anytime that balance changes, something happens that upsets that normal balance, you experience stress. I also want to talk about a couple of other definitions that may help us understand stress and anxiety, which are not exactly the same thing, but they are related. So stress is the body's reaction to any change, kind of like we just talked about, and specifically the body's reaction to a change that requires an adjustment in thinking or action. So if you have to change what you're doing, or you have to change how you're thinking about something, then that is something that is stressful. Anxiety is closely related. It's really the feeling part, a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease. Typically, anxiety comes about when we are thinking about or contemplating either an imminent event, something that's happening soon. I felt a little bit of anxiety getting ready for this webinar, an hour ago. Or something with an uncertain outcome. So something where you don't know what's going to happen. And unfortunately, we're all in the midst of a big giant source of anxiety with the COVID-19 pandemic. There are things we know. There are a lot of things we don't know. And the outcomes of certain actions are uncertain. And so that can tend to provoke anxiety. So it's important to understand these things as we move forward and talk a little bit about what stress and anxiety, and specifically stress, does to the brain and the body. Couple more things to remember about stress. We tend to think of stress as something that's always bad and always negative. That's not actually true. Stress is something that happens to everybody, and it is a regular part of life. I want you to think for just a second about something in your life, perhaps today, that caused stress. Did something not go as planned? Did somebody not get ready for work or school on time? Did you forget to buy milk for your coffee? Did the car not start? Anything like that can cause stress. So it's regular, it happens to everyone. Dealing with stress and responding to stress is our body's job. Our body's first job is to protect us and to survive. And so when something happens that's different than what we expect, it's our body's job to respond to it. That doesn't mean it's fun. Stress is often unpleasant while it's happening. And sometimes stress happens around things that ultimately are very small, but may feel very big and very overwhelming while they're happening. It's important to remember that stress can be useful. We're going to talk about positive stress in just a second. It's also, though, important to recognize that stress, and particularly long-term chronic kinds of stress, can be very debilitating. It can lead to burnout. It can lead to some really negative effects. So that's a piece of what we're going to talk about as we move along. As we're thinking about stress, one of the first things that's important to think about is what we call a stress response. As I said in the previous slide, responding to stress is the body's job. The body's job is to keep us safe and to help us to survive, particularly when things are happening that aren't expected. So whenever you're faced with a stressor, your body is going to respond. And so you're going to have both physical and psychological changes. Those of you who have been through training with me before are familiar with this example. I want you to think about the experience of being in a near miss in your car. So you almost hit something, you almost hit a car in front of you, you almost hit a tree, you almost hit a deer. Any of those kinds of experience. That's a type of experience that any of us who drive or ride in cars have likely had at some point. So I want you to think for just a second about what that feels like and what your body feels like. Not hopefully, but I'm sure you're imagining anxiety. You're imagining your muscles tensing up, your face flushing, some of those kinds of things. All of those are biological processes in the stressful situation that are part of what we call a stress response. So when your brain perceives something that's stressful, again, something that's different than expected, something you need to cope with, the first thing it does is release massive amounts of the stress hormone cortisol into the brain and body. And the purpose of that cortisol is to set up a response. We often call it a fight or flight response. Some people say the better description is fight, flight, or freeze response, because those are the things you typically do when you're faced with stress, when you're in that survival mode. Now, if you're in the car and you almost hit the car in front of you, you're not necessarily going to literally fight. But what fight means in this case is you're going to figure out a way to get through it. You're going to slam on the brakes. You're going to swerve. You're going to reach your arm out and try and stop the person that's sitting next to you, even though that never works. So you're going to do something to get through it. You also may literally or figuratively run away. That's the flight piece, and really the freeze piece as well, where you're going to avoid whatever's going on. Now, if you're the one driving the car, that's probably not a very good idea in the car crash scenario. You really need to do something. If you're a passenger in the car, what you may do is you may cover up your eyes and just not look, and you're running away psychologically from this experience. And part of this response is your body responding in particular ways. So your heart rate may go up. Your blood pressure, if you measured it, would be high. Again, your face may be flushed. You may sweat. You may be breathing harder. You're going to have that rush of adrenaline in the body. And what that allows you to do is have highly focused attention. So if you're the one driving that car, in that moment when that car stops short in front of you, the most important thing you've got to do is stop or swerve or whatever you can do to try to avoid this accident that may be about to happen. So you don't need to be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. You don't need to be thinking about what you're going to do for your child's birthday party next month. You need to be focused just on this situation. And that's what this stress response does. It's a biological response. You do not have to do anything specific to make it happen. The other thing that happens during this response is that the primitive parts of the brain take over. So again, you're reacting, you're not thinking logically, you're not thinking through, oh no, that car just stopped. I better take my foot off the gas. I better put my foot, what's going to happen in that time? You're going to, before you could even finish that thought, you're going to hit that car. So you need to react without thinking through carefully. So you can see how this could be a useful thing. It's also something that sticks with you. If you think about after that situation where you almost hit the car in front of you, you tend to be a little shaky. You feel a little wobbly. Your heart's still pounding for a second. Your hands shake. You may be breathing hard. Those kinds of things. It takes the body a little bit of time to process out all that adrenaline and all that cortisol, so that you don't, so that you can get past that stress response. So for a few minutes, you're gonna be in that heightened state of awareness and that highly focused attention. To really understand what's going on, though, we also need to understand a little bit about the brain. And this part of the brain is a really important one in dealing with stress. This is a part of the brain that is located fairly deep inside the brain. You're looking at a cutaway if you imagine cutting deep into the brain. And the part of the system that we're talking about is the limbic system, which is really the emotional response center of the brain. And so the little brown looking structure that's not highlighted in this image is called the amygdala. This is the part that registers fear and other emotions. And it registers them very quickly, and it causes the body to respond. The amygdala works closely with the hippocampus, the part that you see highlighted here. The hippocampus is the memory center of the brain, and it allows you to remember experiences you've had and hopefully to learn from them. It's important to know when we're thinking about children, this part of the brain develops very, very early. It is well developed in infants and toddlers, long before their language ability, their logical thinking abilities, all of those kinds of abilities are well developed. And so it's important to understand when something stressful happens to a baby or happens to a child, this part of the brain is well geared to respond. What's not easy and what these young children don't have is the ability to go back later and think logically about what happened to them. So again, another view of the brain. I want to highlight here in the upper left, there's a arrow pointing to the cerebral cortex. That is the outermost parts of the brain that are responsible for our conscious thoughts, language, actions, decision making, and so on. And those parts of the brain do not, they start developing early on, but they're not well developed until late adolescence. And so again, a young child faced with a stress has a very active limbic system that enables them to respond emotionally, but not a very well-developed cerebral cortex that enables them to think logically about it. And that gives you some information in terms of how children respond to stress. All right, so that's sort of your basic anatomy and biology overview of what's going on in the body and the brain. I want to move on and talk a little bit about stress, what causes stress in your life, and then how we cope with stress. So I want to encourage you to type in the chat box things that you think of that cause stress. Shanisha, if you'll read some of them, that would be helpful. What in your life is causing stress? It could be big, it could be small. I'll give an example while people are typing. My cats cause me stress sometimes. My cats have taken very seriously the job of working with me since I'm primarily working at home. But one of them tends to throw up on my feet in the middle of webinars. I'm really hoping that's not going to happen today. That's not a life-changing event. I clean it up. It's all good. There's nothing wrong with her. She just eats too fast, but it's it's certainly stressful while it's happening. All right, Shanisha, I see a whole bunch of responses. Can you share a few?
We have finances.
Finances.
Routine.
Yes.
Work. Virtual learning with kids.
Virtual learning with kids. I can imagine. Yes.
Divorce.
Mm-hmm.
An ill mother living in the home with us.
Yeah. That one has multiple levels because it's illness, it's somebody else, and it's also sharing your life and your home with them.
Right. So many uncertainties in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Home improvement and limited time to get it done.
Yes.
The internet cutting out, and let's add in the factor of Georgia's weather.
Weather that contributes to internet problems. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Job stress. My son is grieving the death of.
Shanisha, I think you're muted again.
Sorry about that. COVID.
Okay. COVID for sure.
Mm-hmm. Dog having surgery. Yep. Exposure to COVID at work.
Oh yeah, that's a big stress.
So there are a
lots and lots
we have here from families or from individuals that are on here.
Well, and what I want to do with this slide is highlight just a few that I came up with. And the purpose is not necessarily to read each of these deeply, but just to give you an impression. So work, relationships, children, deadlines, money, school, insurance, home care, lawn care, aging, cooking, health, disorganization, pets, as I mentioned, vacation, even though it's fun, can be stressful, taxes, pain, weddings, again, can be fun, but also stressful. Wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, social distancing, politics, the election, racism, sexism, the news. And then all of this right now, most of those are things that we deal with regularly anyway, and all of them right now are overlaid with this stress of COVID-19, which has changed so much and continues to change so much of the routines of how we live life. And there's so much uncertainty that goes with it. I mentioned that in the beginning. That's part of stress and anxiety, is the uncertainty. So much uncertainty goes with COVID because we don't know what it's going to look like next week, next month, how long we're going to need to wear masks. Are we we going to be able to go back to a regular classroom soon? And what's that going to look like? And, are we being exposed? Are we not? Who's going to get sick, etc. So that's just adds a number of additional layers of stress for adults, of course, but also for children. Even young children, even if they don't understand what COVID-19 is and don't understand the ins and outs, they know things are different. They know they're not going to school like they used to, or they're going to school and it looks very different. People are wearing masks. Lots and lots of things are very different. So it's a big source of stress for all of us right now. And keep in mind, it's not just us. I tell my college students this all the time when they tend to think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? COVID is causing this challenge in my life. I have to keep reminding them, yes, it is. And I don't want to minimize that, but it's also happening for everybody. And so I want to look for just a second at some of the common signs and symptoms of stress. This is far from an exhaustive list, keep in mind. These are a few that you may notice. And I divided them up into body, mind, and emotions. You'll notice some of them look similar across several categories. And a lot of times you're going to have signs across multiple categories when you're experiencing stress. So physical signs may include pain, exhaustion. Maybe you're not sleeping well, or maybe you are trying to do too much. Physical clumsiness. This is one that I notice in myself. When I get too stressed, I start tripping. I start bumping into things. I find a bruise on my arm and I have no idea how I got it. I tend to be clumsier. Nausea, dizziness, and then that susceptibility to infection is a big one. This is one we see in college students a lot. They may be under a lot of stress at the end of a semester for final papers and final exams and those kinds of things. And during that time that those things are going on, they're kind of in a longer term stress response. And so they've got a lot of adrenaline keeping them going, pushing them to, do more than they might have otherwise. But as soon as they're done and as soon as they go home for the holidays, they get sick. And that's because their immune system has been suppressed this whole time. The adrenaline's been kind of pushing them through. But as soon as that source of stress is gone, then they're susceptible to any germ that's out there. And that's something certainly we've got to keep in mind this winter as college students are coming home and COVID is still about, that they may also be, there's a possibility they may also be more susceptible to it. Mental kinds of things, poor decision making. Some people make poor decisions because they've never learned how to make good decisions, but when you're under stress, you often make poor decisions. Memory loss, forgetfulness, loneliness, which is both mental and also emotional. Lack of motivation. And then on the flip side of lack of motivation, sometimes what we see is frantic busyness. You're trying to do everything and you're trying, I don't know how many of you read ideas for your time at home, and you need to start a garden, and you need to start a sourdough starter, and you need to exercise 2 hours a day, and you need to take your children on long educational walks, and all of this kind of stuff. That frantic busyness is something that a lot of people try at the beginning of a long-term stressful situation and then discover that it's just too much and you can't maintain that forever. Emotionally, we see a lot of things. We see apathy, lack of interest in some people, certainly that sense of loneliness, isolation, unhappiness, irritability, unreasonable anger, getting mad, flying off the handle at people or at things and not knowing exactly why, or responses that are way out of proportion for what the situation is, can be signs of underlying stress. Again, this is far from an exhaustive list. Oh, sorry, I skipped a page. The other thing that's important to remember is that not all stressors are the same. So we can basically divide stresses into 3 different levels. This is true for children. This is also true for adults, but especially as we think about how to support and nurture children through stress. The first level of stress we call positive stress. And I always say we don't call it positive because it's fun and we enjoy it while it's happening, but it's positive because you learn something from it and you learn how to cope, and you learn some of those skills that get you through other stressful situations. So most positive stresses are little things. You lose your keys, you forget your wallet, you trip over the dog while you're trying to fix breakfast, those kinds of things. They're annoying when they happen. They may be very upsetting when they happen. They don't tend to have long-term negative effects. For a child, it may be something that we as adults consider silly, like somebody takes your favorite toy, or daddy says you can't have a cookie 10 minutes before dinner. Those are stressful things when you're a 2 or a 3-year-old. But again, you learn how to cope when you really want a cookie and you can't have one. And you learn how to cope when somebody takes something from you. So these stressors are positive because you learn from them. The other 2 levels, we're talking about much more long-term kinds of things. We're talking about long-term illness, chronic illness. We're talking of a child or a family member, the death of a parent or grandparent or other close relative, divorce, family violence, neighborhood violence, abuse, neglect, all of those kinds of very long-term kinds of things. These stressors certainly, first of all, they tend to last longer, and they tend to have more negative effects on brain development. What really distinguishes them, a tolerable stress from a toxic stress, has to do with the support that we have to get through that stress. So if I'm a 2-year-old and my mother died, that's a really, really stressful situation. At 2, I may not understand what that means. I don't know where she is. I don't know why she's not coming back. I miss her. I'm feeling a huge amount of stress. Now, if I am left to deal with that all by myself, it's going to be a really negative situation, and it may have some really long-term negative effects. If there's somebody else in my life, another parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, a close friend, who can help me get through it and help me talk about it and help me understand and help me know what's going on and what happened and that it's not my fault and all of those kinds of things, then it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging for a long time, but eventually I should be able to figure out how to cope and to integrate this into my life. So that's one of those important keys for how we support children under stress, is being that person, being that support that helps them. We can't always remove the source of the stress, but we can help children learn how to cope and how to get through it. And with that, I'm going to quickly switch screen shares. I want to share a very short video clip. And this video clip is one of the best descriptions I have seen of toxic stress and why it is such an issue. So give me just a second to pull this up. This is about a 1.5-minute video clip. This is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Can you hear this?
Yes.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, again, just a quick introduction to toxic stress that kind of helps reinforce some of what I have just been sharing about stress. Go back to the slides quickly. Okay, so with that as a foundation, I want to talk a little bit about the dangers from prolonged stress. Again, these are those higher level stresses, these more challenging situations, these things that aren't just quickly and easily resolved in a child's life. So some of the things we see when children are under stress long term: fewer connections in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain I referred to earlier where your thinking, language, decision making, all of those kinds of functions are happening. So when there are fewer connections and less strong connections in that part of the brain, children are less prepared to solve problems, to use language to resolve things, to express their feelings. We tend to see a dominance of survival instincts where children are doing anything they can to survive. Again, that stress response is always activated. And so they're always just surviving this immediate stress that they're dealing with. And a lot of times we see that in what we call hyperarousal, where a child has a hair trigger temper. So they may be in a perfectly safe situation, but their brain is not able to perceive that. And so if somebody else does something that's innocent, they brush past them or something like that, the child may haul off and hit the person or bite the person or, react in a way that is way out of proportion for what happened. That's a sign that the brain is under so much stress that the child really can't cope with it. We sometimes see the flip side in children too, children who are absolutely catatonic with, in dealing with stress. They're not reacting, they show no emotion, they're not interacting with anybody. And that is just as big a concern. Unfortunately, sometimes those are the children who don't get as much attention when they're under stress because they don't cause any problems. And so paying attention both to those who act out and show inappropriate anger and those who are not reacting at all is really important. A lot of children tend to show more impulsivity when they're under long-term stress, a reduced ability to learn. Again, that prefrontal part of the brain is not developing in the same way. And then reduced abilities to self-regulate and reduced cognitive flexibility. So they get fixated on one thing and they're not able to see multiple different ways to handle a situation or solve a problem. And if you think about any of the children you can see why all of these could be really big problems as a young child grows into an elementary school child who needs to interact in school, get along with friends, perhaps be involved in other activities outside of school. Not being able to regulate your own behavior, not being able to respond appropriately are going to be big problems in learning, in social interactions, and in lots of other areas of life. And this is where our understanding of the ACEs study really comes in and helps us understand a little more about what's happening in the brain. Many of you may have heard about the ACEs study, and there are many other, I'm talking right now about the initial one. There are many, many other follow-up studies that have happened since the initial one. But this initial ACEs study was a study of the effects of adverse childhood experiences, that's where the term ACEs comes from, on adults' physical and mental health. So this first study was a survey of 17,000 adults. That's a pretty, that's not a gigantic, enormous sample, but it's a pretty good size sample. And these adults were 66% of them were at least 50 years old. So they weren't studying the children's childhoods. They were asking adults to think back and report on them. These were all Kaiser Permanente patients who were receiving regular physical exams, and they agreed to fill out an additional survey as part of that process. Just over half of them were female, 3/4 of them in the original study were white. So use that to kind of understand and interpret the results, as we talk about them. And there were 10 basic kinds of adverse childhood experiences studied in this initial study. Now, again, there have been many other studies of this same topic since then. Some of them have expanded the list of adverse childhood experiences to include a lot of other things, such as neighborhood violence, experiences of racism, experiences of other kinds of discrimination, which certainly can have long-term effects as well. But the initial ones were 3 types of abuse: emotional, physical, and sexual; 2 types of neglect: emotional and physical; and then 5 other things that they called household challenges. Was your mother treated violently by somebody in your house, by your father, by a partner, a spouse, a significant other? Substance abuse in the household when you were growing up. Again, this is asking adults to think back on their childhood. So did somebody abuse drugs, alcohol when you were growing up? Was there serious mental illness, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, any of those kinds of things? Was there a separation or divorce? If you started out in a family where you had parents who were married, did they separate? Did they divorce while you were a child? And was there a household member incarcerated? So all of those are the things that they were looking at to begin with. You notice none of these, other than perhaps abuse, is necessarily a physical kind of thing in itself. But they have what they discovered is that there are a lot of effects on your physical health of experiencing these kinds of ACEs. All right, I'm going to give you just a quick second. Hang on, let me grab this link. Let me stop sharing for just a second. I'm going to grab this link and put it in the chat. If you would like to find out what your ACE score is, I'm going to paste a link in the chat box to enable you to do that. Okay, there's the link. If you've already done it, or you already know your ACE score, or you don't want to know, you certainly are not required to, and you're certainly not required to report what your score was. Hang on, let me go back up. But if you are interested, this is a really quick quiz, and all the ACEs score is asking you to count or to report how many of these things did you experience. It's not asking you about how much, they're just asking, did this happen? Did this happen? They're not asking about quantities. They're not asking about how often. It's really just a very quick count. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about what we know about ACEs. Again, if you are still working on your score, feel free to do that. And then you can look at your score and kind of compare it to this chart here. This chart is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This is not my chart, but it comes from the data from this original ACEs study. So this is how common ACEs are. Based on people's report, just over 1/3 of people didn't experience any of those 10 things, which is fantastic. About 1 in 4 experienced 1. 16% experienced 2. Just under 10% experienced 3, and 12.5% experienced 4 or more ACEs. So if you look at the yellow bar and the 2 darkest green bars, that's almost it's about 1/3 of this circle who experienced at least 2 different kinds of adverse childhood experiences. And one of the things that they discovered in this research, as we're going to look at in just a second, is the more of these you experience, generally higher numbers of ACEs increase your risk for health and physical and mental health challenges later on. So if you look at the chart, especially on the right-hand side here, it gives you an idea of how the number of ACEs that you experienced, reported experiencing as a child, affects your risk for negative health and well-being outcomes. So you can see if you have none, you've got a little bit of risk. If you have 5 or more, your risk is much higher. And on the left-hand side of this slide, if you look at it, it's showing some of the things that have been shown to correlate with ACEs. So health measures. People with more ACEs tend to be at higher risk of obesity, higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of depression, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. I mentioned that stress causing you to be clumsy as an issue. Higher levels of ACEs also correlate with a greater likelihood of smoking, greater likelihood of abusing alcohol, greater likelihood of abusing drugs, prescription drugs, street drugs, and so on. And then higher numbers of ACEs tend to be negatively correlated with graduation rates, academic achievement, and then positively correlated with lost time from work. So you have more ACEs, you're more likely to miss more time at work, you're less likely to graduate, you're less likely to do well in school. So again, these experiences in childhood can affect a lot of different things in life. And remember, these are largely adults who were 50 plus when they were surveyed. So, so these can have some really long-term effects. Whoops. And if you look here, this is a little bit more complicated of a chart, but it kind of shows where different kinds of behaviors fall out in terms of their likelihood based on how many ACEs you have. So the ones that are to the right on the chart are ones that you're more likely to show when you experience more ACEs. It does not mean that not experiencing these things protects you completely, but the more you experience, the more risk you tend to have. Risk also does not mean that you're destined. If you grew up and you had several ACEs, it does not necessarily mean that you can just say for sure, I am headed to being an alcoholic and I'm going to abuse drugs and have diabetes and depression and die of a stroke. It's not that clear, but your risk is higher. And so what this all tells us, and then this picture shows us about life expectancy related to number of ACEs. So people who had 6 or more, which is pretty significant amounts of stress in early childhood, died on average nearly 20 years earlier than those with no ACEs. So that experiencing that high level of stress in early childhood actually related to having a shorter life expectancy. This chart, if you have learned about ACEs, you've probably seen. This is one that the CDC shares and lots of people share. And it really kind of gives us an easy to understand picture of what may happen. So at the base, we've got these adverse childhood experiences that then lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, where we talked about the connections in the brain being affected by toxic stress. That can then lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment because you don't have the brain structures to help get through. All of those things together can then increase your risk for adopting health risk behaviors. You don't exercise enough, you smoke, you drink to excess, and so on, which then leads to potential for disease, disability, and social problems, which leads to the potential for early death. If you notice, the pyramid gets narrower as you go up. So everybody who experiences adverse childhood experiences is not going to experience early death. The number of people affected decreases with each level. But you can see how these things kind of stack on top of each other to really increase risk. Now, the good news is I'm not just throwing all of this depressing stuff at you and saying, okay, sorry, too bad, a lot of our kids are destined to, have risky behaviors and bad health as they grow up. There are a lot of things, and you can see examples on this slide, that have been shown to prevent ACEs or to reduce the impact of them. So home visiting, parenting education, intimate partner violence prevention, preventing mom and dad from abusing each other, or preventing, whatever your adults are in your family from abusing each other. Social support for parents and family members raising children, mental illness and substance abuse treatment. I like seeing high quality childcare on here because we know that that's important as well. And then income matters. Sufficient income support for lower income families also makes a difference. So there are things that can be done to reduce the risk of ACEs, to prevent them before they happen. None of these are easy solutions. None of these are one time, let's have a quick 15-minute conversation and now, okay, great, you have no more risk, you're fine. They're long-term, systemic, in-depth kinds of things that take a lot of time and energy, but they have been shown to be effective. The other thing I want to talk about as we're talking about how to help prevent ACEs is the HOPE framework. HOPE stands for Health Outcomes from Positive Experiences. And it's really a flip side to this whole idea of ACEs, because what it does is look at the different developmental domains and help us to identify not just what bad things are we trying to prevent, but what good things do we want to promote in order to give children that healthy start and that resilience. So you can see in physical, basic physiological needs met, immunity to common childhood diseases, for cognitive, vocabulary and language development, for social, the ability to form and sustain healthy relationships, for emotional, character strengths is an example. There's some more on the next page. Being in supportive, nurturing relationships is a key experience. And then there are examples: secure attachments, warm, responsive, sustained relationships. Living, developing, playing, and learning in safe, stable, protective, and equitable environments. That's a lot in one sentence, but having those places where you live, learn, and play, be safe, be stable so that you can rely on them, protect you, and be equitable. And this is where issues of race and gender and other kinds of equity come in, and how important they are to child development and child health. Constructive social engagement, and then learning social and emotional competencies. When children have all or many of these things, they have the ability and they have the foundation for resiliency that's going to help them to cope with the stresses of life and adverse childhood experiences. So this slide kind of sums up everything that we've just said in looking at the ACEs data and looking at the HOPE model. There are some key factors that mitigate stress. And again, we use the word mitigate very intentionally here. There are many stressors that children face, including most of the ones on the ACEs inventory, that we can't change once they've happened. If a child's parent has died, you can't go back and undo that. No matter how many other adults are in that child's life, that one person is not. But there are things that can happen that can help to make that potentially toxic, stressful event more tolerable. So those loving, responsive, and consistent relationships. If there is one thing I would wish on every child the world over, it's at least one person who is absolutely crazy about them and who is responsive to them, who is there for them, who is emotionally available, who's physically available, who meets their needs, who just loves them like crazy and expresses that to them. That can do as much as a lot of other things in really mitigating this long-term stress. Being in safe and secure environments, having a place where if you're being abused at home, for example, which we hope never happens, but we know it does sometimes. If you have some place else where you are safe, if you're going to childcare, if you're going to school, if you're going to some other kind of a program, and for the time that I am here, no one's going to hurt me. I don't need to be worried about whether I'm going to be abused. Then that gives that stress response a chance to wind down, and it gives you a chance to return to that calm state, if only for a little while, which then helps you to cope better with the stress when it does happen. That does not mean it's okay to leave a child who's being abused in a home where they're being abused just because they're going to school, and so they're not being abused all day, every day. But that is a factor that can help reduce a little bit of that stress. Learning social and emotional skills, learning the names for emotions, learning how to respond appropriately to your own and other people's emotions, learning how to interact with people appropriately, all of those things can help to mitigate stress. Experience regulating stress in supportive environments. This is always my favorite one to talk about because unfortunately at the university, I see the negative effects when children don't grow up having this. So children need opportunities to experience and deal with these positive stresses that I talked about toward the beginning, because learning how to cope with them, again, gives them the skills to deal with other stressors as they come up. What I see sometimes, at the university level are kids who have never experienced any kind of stress in their lives, because when something goes wrong, somebody fixes it for them. Mom brings them their lunch. Grandma helps them do their homework. When they get a bad grade, somebody goes to school and yells at the teacher until the teacher makes it better. They've never had to they don't have to fix their own food. They don't have to wash their own clothes. They don't have to keep up with their own homework. They don't, they've never had to cope when something doesn't go as planned. And those are the kids that fall apart, honestly, in college, because unless the parent is coming to college with you and continuing that kind of support, that's a time when you're more on your own, and something is going to go not as planned. There's going to be a fire drill at 2 a.m. when you're asleep, or you're going to oversleep and miss a class and, so miss a quiz or something like that, or you're not going to know how to do your laundry, or, any of those kinds of things. And students who get to this point in college and can't cope with those things absolutely just fall apart when bigger stresses happen, when they don't get into the major they want, when their study abroad program is canceled for the summer because of COVID, those kinds of things. And so we want kids to have a chance to learn how to deal with stress and to not always be rescued from every stress when they're young, so that they build that confidence in themselves and that competence to actually be able to manage their own stresses. And then all of these are tied together in a quality that we call resiliency. And resiliency is really a lot of things. It is in part an internal set of qualities, but it's also things that we as adults can nurture in children. Again, providing them experience coping when things go wrong is one way to help build and strengthen that sense of resiliency. So, all of these together can help to reduce some of the negative effects of long-term chronic kinds of stress. On this slide, we talk a little bit about responsive adults, because I said that is the thing I want most for children, is one loving, responsive adult. Responsive adults aren't just people who say, "Oh, I love you." You need to take into account all of these things: being physically available, of course, being with the child, being near the child, but also emotionally available. And that means paying attention to the child. That maybe means not having your nose stuck in your cell phone every second of the day. Having some time when you're interacting with your child and other things are not the concern. Being sensitive to what the child needs and wants, respecting the child's feelings. That doesn't mean you have to give them what they want, but acknowledge that they have feelings, give them words to label them, and respect their right to be upset if you say no to something that they want. Providing them opportunities to explore, offering positive guidance, teaching them what to do as opposed to just what not to do, and then being consistently available, consistent in your rules, consistent in how you respond. All right, I'm going to share one more video. This, again, it may be familiar to a lot of people. This is the still face experiment, which is a classic experiment in developmental psychology, that shows you what happens when parents are not attuned and not responsive to babies. So if you haven't seen this, you might want a couple of tissues. It's a little heartbreaking.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yes.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Any reactions to this? I saw that there were some things in the chat. I see a lot of people saying that it hurts. This video gets you every time. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to watch. And my favorite little piece of trivia about that still face experiment, it was originally set up so that it was going to last 3 minutes. And almost no baby was able to get all the way to 3 minutes without getting so upset that they had to stop the experiment. So it shows you how quickly babies recognize when adults, and the mom was right there. It's not that she wasn't physically available. She was not responding emotionally in that appropriate way. So as we move along and kind of tie up some loose ends, the other thing I want to make sure that everybody understands about coping with stress, and something that's very relevant to COVID-19 right now, is the importance of consistency. Consistency and those consistent routines, consistent activities, knowing what to expect is one of the major ways that young children feel secure. They're not able to tell time. They maybe don't have well enough developed language to be able to talk about, okay, what's coming next. So they depend on things happening in predictable and repeated kinds of ways. So this minimizes stress, it reinforces brain connections, it helps them to be both more confident. If you know what to expect, you're more you feel more confident that you can handle a situation. It also helps them be more competent, so they actually are better able to cope, to be self-reliant, to be independent within that situation. And then it also helps with self-regulation. Now, right now in the middle of COVID, one of the hard things for young children when COVID started is all of the routines that they relied on got badly disrupted, maybe completely removed, but certainly they looked very, very different. For some kids, they maybe either have now started to develop a new set of routines and expectations, or they've gone back to some of the things that they missed at the beginning of the pandemic. But in either case, it's important to remember, and it's important to realize how much stress that not knowing what to expect, not knowing what was going on, not understanding why are we all at home when we normally go to school, why can't I go to my ballet class, etc. Any of those things, didn't make any sense to children. And it doesn't matter as adults how many times we try to explain it. They don't have the language, they don't have the brain development to really understand it. So if you are a parent, if you are a grandparent, if you are a caregiver of children, setting up some sort of a consistent, stable routine and maintaining that as best you can is really, really important for your children. It may not look anything like it did pre-pandemic, but having that stability and knowing what to expect matters. If you are a professional who works with families, letting families know how important this is and that this is one of the major ways to reduce children's stress is equally important. And with that, I want to talk just a little bit about some simple stress relieving activities. Again, none of these are new. None of these are things you've never heard of in your life. But I want you to remember that there are physical strategies, mental and emotional ones, and then creative ones. So physical activity, creative movement, sleep, using deep breathing. Deep breathing can be very effective in slowing your heart rate and in bringing you down to a sense of calm. Laughter, the physical effects of laughter, and then listening to music, all of those, or creating music, all of those can help cope with stress. In terms of mental and emotional strategies, for anybody who's old enough, journaling, just writing about whatever it is that's going on. It does not have to be great prose, does not have to be anything you'd ever want to publish. It's just releasing feelings. For young children, drawing or painting or scribbling in a journal can have some of the same effects. Playing music, again, creating music. Literature, there's a lot of good children's literature related to dealing with stress. I've got a picture in the bottom center. Anybody, if you don't know the book, The Invisible String, it is worth checking into. It's a great book about how we are all interconnected. You can use it for talking about going to school. You can use it about family members who are far away. It's great for moving to a new place. It's even great for a child dealing with death. There is a passage talking about an invisible string connecting us to Uncle Brian in heaven. Now, you have to be aware of the religious belief that is being shared there, but if that is part of your religious belief, that it can be helpful with bereavement as well. Being with others and helping others, volunteering, supporting other people is important. And then all of these creative things, which overlap a lot with the others. Any kind of creative arts, painting, drawing, sculpture, pottery, knitting, cross-stitching, crocheting, any of those kinds of things. Again, journaling, and that can be writing, it can be drawing, it can be painting. Using guided imagery, pretending that you are in a place. Music, dance, all of those kinds of things can help children to cope with and adults to cope with stress. I want to share a couple more quick examples, and then we will wrap up because it is 3 o'clock. My current favorite way of teaching deep breathing to children. It's a little hard to explain what you mean by deep breathing, but my favorite is the flower and the candle. So you give children a silk flower, you give them a birthday candle. You do not light the birthday candle because you're not going to give young children a lighted birthday candle, but you give them these two things and you explain to them that these are their tools for deep breathing. So when you want them to breathe in, you tell them to smell the flower and breathe in and smell as much of it as they possibly can. And then for breathing out, they need to blow out the birthday candle as hard as they can. And children starting at about 2.5 or 3, you can help them to understand that they're pretending that they can't really smell the flower. They're not going to really blow out the candle, but they're pretending to do these things. But it can help them learn how to regulate their breathing. So you see on here some other examples. I also have a handout that I will send out with some other examples and some children's books and some other things that can help children reduce kind of that immediate stress. So key points: what happens in childhood matters in adulthood. Children are never too young to be affected. Keep that in mind. There's no such thing as, oh, it doesn't matter, she's too young, she's not going to remember it, because these things are processed in the limbic system from early on. It's also important to remember that difficult behaviors may be the result of stress, and that affects how you address those behaviors. That affects what do you do when a child is misbehaving. Absence of response can also cause stress. Adults can help mitigate stress, but building relationships takes time and patience. So things to contemplate as you think about helping children cope with stress. And with that, I want to wrap up with a quote. Dr. Bruce Perry is a medical doctor, a PhD, and one of the leading child trauma researchers. And his quote says, "When you look at children who come out of terrible environments and do well, you find someone in their lives somehow instilled in them the attitude that they aren't helpless, that they aren't powerless, that they can do something." So please be that person to children who need you and who need your support. I'm going to stop with that. I'm going to stop my sharing. I appreciate your time and attention. I would be happy to stick around and answer questions from anybody who's got questions. In the meantime, I'm going to stop the recording, and Shanisha, will you explain about the survey?
Yes.